Hi, I'm Fiona Hollings, and I'll be talking to you about my lived experience of being autistic and having anorexia. I will cover a bit about me, my experiences, and my journey, the influence of discovering I was autistic, how I experienced the overlap between being autistic and having an eating disorder, and why it's important to be curious about autism and eating disorder treatment. So, a bit about me. I have battled anorexia since I was 14, and since then I've had points of complete remission from my eating disorder, and I've had times of significantly struggling with it too. I've experienced many and lengthy hospital admissions, and I finally received my autism diagnosis in 2022, aged 24. So, my journey. When I was young, I was a very happy child. I used to laugh a lot. And people said I was quirky and in my own world, but I was content in my own world. And generally, I was very settled. However, as I got older, there was an increasing turbulence in how I was feeling. I became a lot more aware of feeling different. I struggled with socializing and interacting with others. I struggled to make friends. I felt exhausted and like I couldn't keep up with other people's interests and trends. And I felt like everyone got a book of how to behave and what to say and how to act. And I didn't get a copy. And I constantly felt like I got things wrong, and that led me to feel like I was wrong as a person. And so I squashed who I was, and I copied those around me in a desperate attempt to fit in, to be accepted, to get it right. But I don't think I ever got it right. And I really started to struggle. I didn't understand why I felt the way I did, why I felt so wrong. But on the surface, I was okay. I was performing in the top 5% of my year group at school. I was punctual and always attended. And I had mastered the art of smiling and saying I was fine. I was not fine. As I got older, the difficulties of being autistic in a neurotypical world, especially undiagnosed autistic, were emphasized. And this was heightened when I was 11 and moved to high school. Now, around this time, there are significant changes, which, as an autistic person, I find very difficult to manage. There were less obvious changes, things like my body changing, hormones, how I felt in myself, but then really obvious changes too, like moving schools. Moving to high school was a sensory nightmare for me. Everything felt louder, brighter, and bigger, and I felt constantly overstimulated. All classrooms had computers in and what felt like strobe lighting, and all I could hear was the buzz of electricity. The canteen was thick with different smells and conversations, and it was all so loud and intense, and I felt like I lived in a constant state of stress or survival mode. But I didn't really understand why I felt that way, only that I was exhausted. I didn't have many friends, so I sought refuge in the library. And I quickly became fixated on studying anyway, as that felt like one objective measure of how I was, who I was, and something I could better. Pressure. I was always a high-achieving student, but there was suddenly an increased pressure to not only remain high-achieving, but constantly do better. Now, high school is characterized by teachers telling you that this piece of homework, this essay, this exam is integral to your success in life, and you have to do your absolute best and hardest work at it. And I took a very literal interpretation of that message. But there was also a constant social pressure to keep up with, which felt more complex than ever. Trends that I did not understand and seemed to change daily. politics of friendships and boyfriends and gossip and trying to work out how to relate to people that I just didn't understand. And they didn't understand me. I became the target for bullies. I was easy. I didn't react. I just looked down and willed myself to be invisible. Surely being invisible will be better than standing out this much. If I could blend in, fit the mold, do and behave as I was supposed to do, and like everyone around me seemed to be able to do so naturally, then maybe I would feel better. Maybe I would be accepted. And maybe if other people accepted me, then they would like me more. And maybe, just maybe, if other people liked me more, then I would like myself. Masking. I spent more time copying, mimicking, pretending and masking than I did not. And I felt like I completely lost who I was in this process. My sense of self became fractured. I didn't allow myself to have my own interests as I was concerned they weren't acceptable. I didn't allow myself to have an opinion. I became a nodding dog. I went from being loud to saying less, to speaking incredibly quietly, until I just stopped speaking. I went from tolerating myself to absolutely hating myself. And my mental health nosedived. I was consumed with anxiety. I started self-harming because I hated myself, and I was so frustrated that I kept on getting it wrong, despite trying so badly to get it right. And no one knew, and I had no idea how to cope. And at this point, I wanted help and for someone to talk to, but I didn't know who, and I had no idea what to say. How do you say that you feel so wrong as a person that you don't want to live? Anorexia. Anorexia came into my life very suddenly and very drastically. I was healthy in the summer, and by October of that year had been removed from school and was under crisis intervention. But by this point, I didn't want any help at all. The anorexia felt like I had finally found a way to cope. And this is how anorexia felt for me. It felt like a bubble. On the outside are all the things that I didn't feel able to manage. The loudness, brightness, and vividness of life. The things I found difficult to navigate. Change, social situations, and the building social and academic pressure that I didn't feel I could keep up with. Feeling inadequate, feeling off, not feeling I belonged. And the constant experience that I felt I was getting things wrong. The bubble that anorexia provided was the stark opposite. Instead of multiple layers of confusion, noise, and chaos, there was just one commanding voice: anorexia. It felt calmer and contained. The bubble is predictable and familiar. It's governed by rules which gave me structure, and it made sense to me. It felt simpler. I obeyed. Anorexia was happy. And that felt like, finally, something I could get right. Now, there were aspects of my presentation of anorexia that were atypical from the start. Initially, I went through standard treatment, CBTE, seeing a dietitian, but I found it very difficult to engage, and that made me feel like I was getting my treatment wrong too. I didn't experience a lot of what I thought I should, like body image issues. I was told things like, "We won't let you get fat," and that felt meaningless. I didn't care. And that caused me to further push down how I felt and what I was struggling with. I struggled to open up in therapy. I struggled to know what I was feeling, both physically with interoceptive cues and emotionally in understanding and regulating my emotions, and I frequently became incredibly overwhelmed. I spent over a year in therapy either going mute or saying, "I don't know." And in many ways, I didn't know. It was suspected that a lot of my behaviours were driven more by OCD thoughts and rituals around numbers than being outcome-based. For me, losing weight felt like a side effect to behaviours I felt compelled to do based on them being part of my routine or ritualistic. I struggled with intense rigidity and need for structure and planning, but this wasn't just around food, this was in all aspects of my life. But I also did struggle in treatment. I struggled with change and changes to my meal plan, though it was the process of change I was finding difficult, and the resistance was adding new foods, not necessarily more food, but I'll come back to that later. Now, many of these difficulties or differences I was told were completely down to the anorexia and would resolve if I got better. And I always found that hard to believe because they had been there for a lot longer than the anorexia had. And if anything, the anorexia had eased some of them. Over the next 7 years, I continued to struggle with my mental health. Whilst always having the utter determination to get better, be better, do better, I constantly felt there was something inherently wrong with me, and every time I relapsed, it contributed to this feeling, and the spiral deepened. I experienced many admissions to hospital, an increase in my self-harming and suicidal behaviours, and I had a severe relapse of the anorexia that led to a 2.5-year admission under the Mental Health Act, where I was sent to Scotland. During this time, I was given a list of diagnoses that never felt they fit, put on a huge number of strong medications, and I experienced very invasive treatment methods. And these were some of the words I was described as: unpredictable, resistant, non-compliant, and difficult. And this is how I felt: like a failure and hopeless. Through this time, I was learning though. Every time I went round the spiral, I understood more about myself. What made things easier, what triggered me, what to do when I struggled, what not to do when I struggled. I didn't know it then, but most of these were adaptations for autism. Now, autism had been mentioned a couple of times, but I had dismissed it based on the narrow stereotyped version I had in my head. In the meantime, I managed to get home. I started university, but I was very much holding things together at this point. However, the thought of autism grew, and I finally did my research. I learned about the spectrum. I read books and blog posts, and it felt like finally something made sense. So in true autistic style, I wrote my psychiatrist a 12-page letter detailing all the things I had noticed and had been pointed out to me, all the things that would make sense if I was autistic, all the things that had helped and hindered me throughout my life. And my psychiatrist, before even finishing the letter, agreed it was highly likely I was autistic and made the referral for an assessment. Now, as I'm sure many of you are aware, there is a considerable waiting list for an autism assessment, so we decided to make adaptations based on a suspected autism diagnosis. And making these adaptations was really important, as unfortunately, during this time, the anorexia had taken a really strong hold again. And a few months after the formal referral for an autism assessment was made, I was admitted to hospital for the anorexia. However, this hospital admission differed from all the previous admissions I'd had. and I do believe that was down to the autism accommodations made. That admission was the one of shortest duration. I experienced the least invasive treatment. I felt I had a really positive relationship with my treatment team, and most importantly, I've not been readmitted since. Adaptations for autism are essential because autism is who I am. It's the way my brain works, whereas the anorexia is an illness to recover from. So considering adaptations, it's really important to work with the autism to help overcome the anorexia. So what were those adaptations? Working with my need for routine and consistency. I have the same appointment each week with the same person at the same time in the same room, and that helps me more than I can explain. Understanding resistance to change. I want it to be understood that an autistic person struggling with change is not being non-compliant or difficult, and it does not mean that they don't want to change. It is that change feels like it physically hurts. I also know that change is integral to eating disorder recovery and treatment, though, so it's about best managing that process. Some adaptations that have been made for me are having more time to process changes, focusing on changing one variable at a time, and planning. If I have a good plan, change almost always successfully happens. And I use planning every single day. Every Sunday, I make a detailed plan about the coming week with food, activities, social events, work. And using planning safeguards me from the anorexia because it provides that predictability that I need, which makes me feel less like I need the anorexia, and I can use it to plan in recovery-focused things like around food. I think it is essential to move away from the idea that planning and structure is a bad thing, because as an autistic person, a plan can be a lifeline. It helps me go from feeling completely overwhelmed by a situation to feeling able to manage and look forward to things. Sensory check. There are very basic adaptations when considering the role of the environment on recovery. I struggle with sensory processing, meaning the environment I have my appointments in and the environment that I recover in impact my ability to engage in recovery. So, in appointment rooms, a simple sensory check, such as considering noise and lighting, can take an autistic person from not being able to engage to engaging quickly and well, which has clear implications. But also considering the role of the environment that recovery is happening in. As I discussed earlier, overstimulating environments cause me to feel overwhelmed, enter survival mode, and shut down. And at that point, I'm not even thinking about eating. So, for recovery, I ensure the environment is as calm as possible by using my noise-cancelling headphones, and I almost always have smooth radio on. Now, considering sensory differences, there's also less pressure on having a big variety of food. I have never eaten a huge variety of food, so expecting that in my recovery was unrealistic. Instead, there's an emphasis on enough food, and that's non-negotiable to recover from the anorexia. And that's generally done through having more of the same foods rather than having a new dish 6 times a day. Variety will come, it will just take more time. And different communication styles. I find taking on lots of verbal information difficult and exhausting, and I can shut down. It may look like I'm being difficult and not engaging, but that's not true. I just struggle to use verbal communication when I'm at that point. So, since autism was flagged, we use things like writing, which is my preferred communication style, and interactive mind maps to communicate. Now, we made these adaptations from the point of referral for my autism diagnosis. So 3 years later, when I received my formal autism diagnosis, actually not a lot changed. Though in my assessment, the psychiatrist said something to me that will stay with me for the rest of my life. There is nothing wrong with you. You're autistic. Yes, I have a different way of experiencing and processing the world. Different, not wrong. So how did having my autism recognised help me? It helped me understand why I felt the way I did for so long, why I felt odd, that I didn't belong, why I found certain things more difficult, and why I excelled in certain areas. And not just me, but the people close to me too. My family, my friends, university, and in my eating disorder treatment. It meant we made small adaptations to help manage day-to-day life, which made the biggest of differences to me. For example, having that plan and ensuring that there was enough calm and quiet time. And it helped me understand important factors that contributed to me becoming unwell, which in turn helped me move forwards in my treatment and recovery. And part of that was understanding the overlap between being autistic and having an eating disorder. And this is how I experience some of the overlap, some of the difficulties relating to being autistic that contributed to the anorexia. Social difficulties. Bullying in school made me want to be invisible, shrink down. Anorexia became a way of shrinking, of numbing, of blocking. Feeling inadequate, not fitting in, not feeling good enough, not knowing or understanding how to navigate social situations, all led me to become incredibly anxious and overwhelmed, which made eating difficult, which led to restriction. Exercise became a way of dealing with that anxiety and overwhelm. Getting things wrong. The pervasive feeling that I was getting things wrong and subsequently was wrong as a person. Anorexia felt like something I could get right. Sensory differences. Overwhelming, overstimulating environments were sensory overloads and made eating feel near impossible. Aversions to textures of food meant that I would rather go without than cope with difficulties around such. And interoception differences meant that hunger and thirst were as confusing to me to navigate as social situations. Rigidity and difficulties with change. I very easily get stuck in patterns and cycles and find it near impossible to change and get out of them, which overlaps significantly with exercise rituals I struggle with. Additionally, for me, any change throws my mind into utter chaos and panic, and again, when I'm feeling that panicked, I can't think about eating. And burnout and shutdown. The exhaustion from managing or not managing all of the above. The cumulative effect of sensory overload, social confusion, the panic of change, the paralysis of rituals, and not understanding how I felt and my emotions led to overwhelm, burnout, and shutdown. It's at that point that the bubble feels not only like the best way to cope, but the only way to survive. Now, I also need to note that there are many strengths of being autistic that help me in my recovery. Protective factors. Routine. Whilst creating a recovery-focused routine and structure may be tricky at the beginning, once established, I tend to stick to it, no matter what. Planning. When adequately planned, I can do anything. I've learned to use planning in my recovery, such as planning in meal plan changes, but also non-recovery planning that feeds into my recovery, like social events with friends, which improves how I feel about myself, which betters my recovery. To get here today, I didn't just have plan A, B, and C, I went right up to F. Special interests. Knowing there are things I enjoy so much above what my eating disorder can provide. I know I would rather spend hours upon hours immersing myself in musical theatre, or the weather, or psychology, or autism, than give hours of my time to my eating disorder. Rational and logical thinking. I love learning and understanding things. If I can understand why something needs to happen, the medicine behind it, the theory, the processes, then I feel better able to action it. And I use this approach in my recovery, both with my physical and psychological health. Attention to detail and sensitivities. What a gift. I notice things that others don't. I experience the world in full colour, and yes, sometimes overwhelming. Experiencing the world in full colour inevitably leaves you feeling drained at points. But having the knowledge that that is a risk means that I can manage my energy levels to make sure that I don't burn out. And when properly managed, it's something I'm learning to love. And struggling to understand other people. This too, I've learned, can be a gift. I do struggle to understand social situations, non-verbal language, secret meanings, and trying to keep up with trends and socially fashionable things. But maybe I don't need to. Not understanding these things has shown me that I'm able to engage in deep conversation with people because I'm there for what is being spoken about. It means that I see things that other people miss. And I'm learning that I hate trends. Discovering my authentic autistic self has shown me that who I am as me is enough. Yes, different, but I wouldn't be up here talking to you all if I wasn't. Different is okay. And that has helped me more in my recovery than I can explain. So why is it important to consider autism in eating disorder treatment? Because autism recognition can be life-changing for someone in their understanding of themselves. An understanding of autism may further explain why someone developed an eating disorder. There are small adaptations that can take someone from not engaging to engaging quickly and well in treatment. And there are many strengths of being autistic that can help a person get better. Now, do you remember that list of words that we used to describe me throughout my whole adolescence? This is how I'm described now. Predictable. Hardworking. Sensitive. Still difficult. I didn't have a personality transfer. And this is how I feel now. Understood. Like I'm discovering who I am, as difficult and as messy as that process is. And passionate. Passionate about raising awareness of autism as a spectrum and the different experiences and presentations to better identify those who are autistic and sooner. Passionate about eating disorder treatment having reasonable adjustments for autistic people to improve outcomes and quality of life. And passionate about autism being better understood and accepted so that autistic people don't end up in crisis situations, distressed or hopeless. Thank you.